Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Web Union, and in this one we start out in the Urushaine Veremetsky section of the front line, where the Russians have made a small advance north of the village, capturing part of the forest line along the road. We see that here the Ukrainians have a strong defensive capability near Makarivka and Blahodatne, where they want to prevent the Russians from making any sort of breakthrough. So they have heavy defenses in the area, and the Russians are slowly pushing through, doing some positional fighting, heavily bombarding the forest line before entering themselves. Further east in the Synkivka section of the front line, the Russians have managed to capture the Dacha area, and this was actually confirmed with this geolocated footage here in this direction. So we see that the Russians have a presence here within the Dacha area, and this means that the Russians are now pushing towards the Ukrainian fortified positions north of Konstantinivka. The objective here is to connect the road from all the way from Marinka down south through Pobieda through the fortified positions of the Ukrainians down to Konstantinivka, which is already connected from Konstantinivka all the way down south to Vodiane. This is to have a strong position along the front line near the road and have a supply road that is connected from Marinka and the Donetsk city itself all the way down south to Volodar, better connecting the two sides. In the Pokrovsk section of the front line, it's very interesting because the smallest push is actually in the direction of Pokrovsk, where the Russians have started to breach the final line of defense ahead of the city itself, where they are now getting a foothold in the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near Synkivka. As we see, they are attacking through the railways and the forest lines associated with them to gain a foothold in the fortified positions before pushing into Synkivka and along the fortified positions. And at the same time, they've already gained control over Mykolaiivka to the northeast and the fortified positions related to it, to then push along the railways and forest lines all the way up to Mirnorod. So far, the Russians have not gained a foothold or started attacking Mirnorod, but positional fighting continues along the fortified positions just southeast of it. We see heavy fighting continues in the area, but only this small advance. In the direction of Selydove, the Russians have managed to push all the way to the center of the town. This shows that the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area is very limited, and this may fall as quickly as Novokhodivka. Naturally, this town of Selydove is much larger than Novokhodivka, so it will take more time, but it will be at the same pace. Considering the changes and how fast they have happened, the Russians have already gained control over both of the heights northeast of the town, and now they're moving into the central parts, where the fighting will take place over the apartment complex area, which is the strongest part of the Ukrainian positions within the town of Selydove. At the same time, there's only one remaining apartment complex area, which is a small one just northwest of that. This indicates that if the Russians gain control over the apartment complex area, then they will fairly quickly get control over the rest of the town. This main reason why the Russians have had much success in the direction of Selydove is that the main defensive lines were located to the east, from Mykolaiivka in the northeast down to Ukrainsk to the southeast, and the Russians simply bypassed all of that by capturing Novokhodivka and attacking down in a southern direction, flanking the entirety of that defensive line. Southeast of that, the Russians have moved from Memrik towards the town of Helitsinivka, which is split into multiple parts, the southern bank and the northern bank of the Vovcha River. Where the northern bank is largely abandoned, the Ukrainians have been unable to defend it, and the Russians have broken through a lot of the fortified positions, pushing the Ukrainians out of the northern part and into the southern part. And at the same time, in the northern parts here, the Russians are pushing through the fortified positions with the road cut off in the northeast and the road about to be cut off in the southwest. The Ukrainians in this area have either fled or are at risk of complete encirclement, where they have to swim across the Vovcha River to get out of it. At the same time, the Russians have managed to gain control over the majority of Karlivka, leaving only a small part remaining under Ukrainian control. This means that the Russians will fairly quickly gain full control over this entire gray zone here to the northwest of Karlivka and Karlivka itself. The advance by the Russians in the direction of Karlivka is geolocated with this footage here. When the Russians gain control over this gray zone area, they'll continue pushing down south along the river line, the fortified positions, and the second line fortified positions east and west of Ukrainsk, down south towards the main supply hub of Hirnik, which is where majority of the supplies goes through in the section of the front line from the western parts. Then there is a connection from the southern parts. We will have to see if the Russians will push through Maximilianivka or will push the Ukrainians down south towards Kurakhove, where the objective would be to simply push them out of the front line and then move on, gain control of more areas. So we see that there are a twofold look for what the Russians will be looking to gain in this area. Either they'll look to pressure the Ukrainians out, gaining control of the area quickly and hitting them while they are on the move, or to encircle them completely by cutting off both the supply lines between Selydove and Kurakhove, split by the Vovcha River line and the Kurakhove Reservoir, and at the same time cutting it off from Maximilianivka and Krasnohorivka towards Kurakhove, or if it will be a simple push towards the reservoir and push the Ukrainians out of the villages and defensive positions that they are currently holding to hit them on the move and inflict as many casualties as possible. Both of the tactics the Russians have used throughout this war, so it is not clear which will be used this time. In the New York section of the front lines, Russians have captured some fortified positions southwest of the city, further solidifying their control over the city and expanding their zone of control. In the Kreminna section of the front line, the Russians are doing some positional fighting, where we see over the past few days there's been some advances by the Russians here to the east of the Serbs River line. I first believed with the first three advances that the Russians were looking to push in the direction of Nevsky, but with the recent push here east of Novosadovo/Terny, it could be a wider advance by the Russians along the entirety of the front line east of the Serbs River line to attack all of the villages and towns on the eastern bank. We have previously seen a general advance by the Russians east of Yampolivka, Terny, and Novosadove, or really just Terny and Yampolivka, this area right here, but the Ukrainians in a series of counterattacks managed to push the Russians away from the villages and towns. Now that the Russians have managed to capture the eastern parts of Makiyivka and are slowly pushing along east of Nevsky and Novosadove as well, the Russians are now attacking on a wider front, which can point towards them increasing the efforts that they are doing to gain control over the eastern bank of the Serbs River line. Or maybe they saw that the Ukrainians have left some positions open if they want to relocate their forces either to the Kupiansk section of the front line or down to the Pokrovsk section of the front line. So we see positional fighting has started here in the east of the Serbs River, and the Russians are making some small advances on a day-to-day basis. Further north here in the direction of Andreevka, the Russians are slightly expanding their zone of control southeast of the village to gain full control over the eastern bank of the Serbs River line. And in the Selydove direction, there was some positional fighting, but no additional advances has been reported. Despite the Russian Ministry of Defense claiming that they have captured Selydove, this is not the case. Further north, the Ukrainians made a counterattack near Peshana and Tabaivka, where they're looking to regain control over the heights and forest lines here in the area, but the Russians with control over the fortified positions have solidified their control, and this was only a matter of positional fighting. It'll likely go a bit back and forth. In the northern direction by Synkivka, the Russians have entered the village for the quadrillionth time, and yet again, there's not geolocated footage of the Russian presence within the town. However, there is no confirmation that they have full control of it as of yet. It was first reported that the Russians have captured the entirety of the village, and with the geolocated footage, that seemed to be the case. However, the Ukrainian sources quickly asserted that they still had a presence within the village, and heavy fighting continues over the final and last part of the southern street of Synkivka. This means that it is likely that the Russians will gain control of it this time, as this is the farthest that they have gone. But fighting still continues, and it was then reported that the Russians actually planted this flag on the 24th of August, which is almost a week ago. That means that the fighting over the final road has actually been taking place for a long time, yet the Russians have yet to capture it. This points towards there being some sort of stalemate as the Ukrainians are making one last push to hold on to Synkivka. The question is, will they be able to do so and successfully, or even potentially push the Russians back, or will the Russians gain control of the remaining parts of the village, push along the forest line here to the west of it, secure the positions in the north, and start the Battle of Petropavlivka just ahead of Kupiansk. Moving on to the Kharkiv section of the front line, we see that the Ukrainians made a small advance here to the west of Tigre, where they've managed to secure the road between Tigre and Vovchansk, and are doing some positional fighting along the forest areas. This is the first advance of the Ukrainians this month, and there's been no Russian advance this month here in the Vovchansk direction. So it is a clear and by definition stalemate here in the Kharkiv direction. Moving on to the Kursk section of the front line, there are two advances by the Ukrainians. Here in the Nechayev direction, the Ukrainians have made a push, but have managed to gain control over the forest area here north of Rusko-Perneshnoi, where their push has managed to push them all the way towards the village of Nechayev. We see that the main advances of the Ukrainians is that they attempt to advance along the roads. However, when that fails and they are stopped by heavy Russian fire, they take alternative means to push along forest areas and off-road pushes towards the Russian positions deeper inside their country to then try and strengthen their main push along the road by having supportive fire from the forest areas and from the off-road directions to then gain control over the remaining parts, securing the road and then pushing onwards. And this is something very interesting, is that we are at the end of August. When the summer period ends and the rain starts falling more often and the mud season begins, it will be more and more difficult for the Ukrainians to continue their current offensive operations in the Kursk direction, as something that hasn't been talked about for the last 3 months, because it has been the summer season, is that both Russia and Ukraine are heavily reliant on good weather for them to move through these areas, especially Western equipment, which is heavier than Soviet equipment. It's more difficult for them to drive through these open fields. This means that the Ukrainians will be reliant on the roads, and being reliant on the roads really limits where and how the Ukrainians can strike, and that makes it easier for the Russians to ambush them and to hit them and attack them with their equipment. An example is this Ukrainian push north of Martinovka. They know that the Ukrainians are going to push along this road, so they set up a very interesting ambush. This is a video of Russians using an FPV drone at a very low altitude, hitting the car right in its face, this armored vehicle. So we see that the Russians are setting up ambushes with drones at just an elevation of just about a meter off the ground. And doing so is very effective because it will be difficult for the Ukrainians to attack them. They will not be able to see them until right before they are hit. And it is very difficult for them to actually shoot it down. There's the risk of friendly fire and so on. So this is actually a very interesting development, and I've never really thought myself to use it in this way, but it seems to be very, very effective. So we see that the Russians are developing new techniques and ideas to stop the Ukrainian advance. They have secured Kurakhove, they have pushed the Ukrainians back from their flanking maneuver, they're ambushing the Ukrainians north of Sucha, and the Ukrainians are forced to push through forest lines and off-roads to push and get any sort of advantage beyond the Russian lines. The heavy fighting continues in the Kursk region, which has turned into largely a stalemate, comparing the recent advances with the prior advances. The Ukrainians at the start were advancing multiple times a day for a significant portion of the front line. Now that the situation has changed, the Russians have established a front line and they're setting up ambushes. The Ukrainians have actually had a net decrease in areas controlled over the past week. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.